Hello, everyone. My name is Kate Dobbs, and along with Arlene Dent, we'll be talking about climate change and infectious diseases. Arlene and I are both pediatric infectious disease physicians at Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital and Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland. There are several related factors that influence the transmission of infectious diseases, including social, political, and environmental factors. And climate affects disease transmission in many ways, as we'll talk about more. But it's important to note that the changes attributable to climate alone are difficult to tease out due to the influence of these other factors. And we can use malaria as an example. So climate change would certainly have an impact on the malaria vector distribution. However, global efforts by governments and ministries of health over the past 10 to 15 years to prevent and treat malaria have led to a pretty dramatic reduction in incidence and mortality. So these social and political efforts outweighed the negative effects that climate change otherwise would have had on malaria epidemiology. Climate change will bring major changes and has brought major changes to the epidemiology of several infectious diseases through changes in the microbial and vector geographic range. And I find it helpful to think about these infectious diseases in some broad categories. The first one being vector-borne diseases. The survival and reproduction rate of insect vectors like mosquitoes and ticks depend on certain optimal climatic conditions, including temperature, precipitation, humidity, even wind and daylight duration. And climate change is likely to affect both the short-term seasonal risk and the more long-term broad geographic ranges of many vector-borne diseases. The second category are zoonoses. So changes in climate and extreme weather events may affect the distribution and emergence of animal hosts, particularly rodent populations. So for example, after heavy rainfalls, there's an increased food availability for rodents. And after mild, wet winters, we see an increase in rodent populations. And so as an example, hantavirus and plague are two zoonoses whose epidemiology may change secondary to changes in rodent populations. Another big category are waterborne diseases. The risk for diarrheal disease related to climate change is expected to increase in many regions of the world. And the most concerning thing with this is the increased risk for cholera epidemics. And then lastly, respiratory infections. So the epidemiology of respiratory infections is affected by climate change, so these changes are often more difficult to study, but we have seen studies that show associations with La Nina events and influenza epidemics in the US and Europe. There are studies showing spikes in pulmonary aspergillosis after the tsunami in Japan in 2011, and studies showing that RSV dynamics may be tied to changes in climate. Another interesting concept in evaluating the effects of global warming on emerging infections is the endothermy barrier, which is discussed by Arturo Casadevall in a letter to the Journal of Clinical Investigation in early 2020. So new infections can emerge by species jump, which for an example, we're all unfortunately very familiar with species jumps by coronaviruses. And it can also occur from increased host susceptibility. And the role of temperature in host defense is often unappreciated. So mammals are pretty remarkable among animals in that they have endothermy and homeothermy, meaning that they maintain an elevated body temperature throughout life. So microbes that are currently transmitted among humans have adapted to endothermy. However, many microbes, especially those that live in the environment in ambient cooler temperatures, this mammalian endothermy creates like an inhibition zone, a thermal inhibition zone for these microbes. And for an example, about 95% of fungal species are inhibited by human core temperatures. This probably accounts for the fact that there are relatively few fungal pathogens that affect humans, but there are many, many fungal pathogens that affect ectothermic species like plants and insects. And given that microbes can adapt to higher temperatures, there's concern that global warming will select for these microbes that have a higher heat tolerance that can break down our endothermic barriers. An example for this is an emerging infection, Candida auris, which emerged several years ago, almost simultaneously on 3 different continents. So Candida auris is a Candida species that's often multi-drug resistant, and the most concerning thing is that it is often resistant to all known antifungals. And the theory behind its relationship to global warming is illustrated in this cartoon, where first we have global warming that raises the ambient climate temperature and selects for fungal clades that can reproduce at mammalian and avian basal temperatures. And then in 2, you have Candida auris that was previously a plant saprophyte, gains thermotolerance and salinity tolerance secondary to changes in wetlands that occurred as a result of global warming. And then in 3, you see thermotolerant Candida auris could have been transplanted by birds across the globe, where they then go to places where they can come in contact with humans, most likely rural areas such as farms where birds and humans are in close contact. And then eventually those humans migrate into urban environments and hospitals where the fungus is picked up. And so the big concern is that there are a large number of fungal species that are already pathogenic to plants and insects and other ectothermic species, which means they already have virulence tools that if they gain the ability to adapt to higher temperatures, they could pose a threat to humans. And the same argument could be made for viruses, bacteria, and parasites. In recent years, there have been several mosquito-borne pathogens that have been introduced or reintroduced to the United States, including dengue and chikungunya. So dengue, chikungunya, and Zika viruses are transmitted by the Aedes mosquito, so Aedes aegypti, which is also known as the yellow fever mosquito, and Aedes albopictus, which is also known as the Asian tiger mosquito, are the vectors for these viruses. And in the Americas, we've had rapid urbanization, changing land use patterns, increased travel that have led people to be in more frequent contact with these vectors. So there's been rapid spread in the Americas and in parts of the US. And though these viruses aren't currently seen in Ohio, I just wanted to illustrate how quickly the epidemiology has changed for these 3 viruses. So for dengue, the worldwide incidence of dengue has increased 8-fold over the last 20 years. So in 2000, there were about 500,000 cases that were reported to the WHO, and in 2019, there were over 4 million. Before 1970, only 9 countries had epidemic dengue, and now there are more than 100 countries where it's endemic. And not only is the number of cases increasing, but we've had more explosive outbreaks. And in this figure, you can see the incidence of dengue from 1990 to 2015 for the different WHO regions. And so the regions in Asia account for about 70% of the disease burden. You can see from this light green line, which represents the Americas, or PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization, that the incidence of dengue has increased pretty dramatically over the past several years. These maps show the spread of chikungunya virus in the Americas between 2014 and 2017. So prior to 2006, chikungunya was rarely reported in travelers in the US. And between 2006 and 2013, there were a handful of cases reported every year in travelers. But then in late 2013, there were reports of the first local transmission of chikungunya in the Americas in countries in the Caribbean. And then in 2014, there were the first reports of local transmission, meaning the mosquitoes in those areas were infecting people in those areas and not related to travel. And this was first reported in the US, in Florida, Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands. And lastly, for Zika virus, from late October 2015 through 2016, you can see from these maps just how quickly Zika virus spread in South America, Central America, and the Caribbean, just showing how quickly these emerging infections can spread. And now we'll talk about the impact of climate change on vector-borne diseases in Ohio. So this information comes from the Ohio Department of Health, and they have a really great website, which is a really nice resource on all things sort of tick related. In Ohio, we do see several tick-borne diseases, most notably Lyme disease, but also other bacterial infections like Rocky Mountain spotted fever, anaplasmosis, and ehrlichiosis. And ticks are also responsible for spreading the parasitic infection babesiosis. And this figure is meant to illustrate how weather and climate affect tick's life cycle and the risk to humans. So each developmental stage of the tick, so eggs, larvae, nymphs, and adults, is affected by temperature. And the activity of ticks at each of those stages is affected by both temperature and humidity. And then the range of other animal hosts and the behavior of the human host are also affected by temperature. And this graph is just another way to illustrate the life cycle of ticks and the risk for Lyme transmission to humans. So the tick that transmits Lyme disease in Ohio is Ixodes scapularis, or the black-legged tick or the deer tick. And the ticks live for about 2 years, and they go through 4 stages. So eggs, larvae, nymphs, and then adults, and then they lay eggs again. And they, in order to survive at each stage of its life cycle, the tick needs to have a blood meal. And they can feed from many different animals. So humans and other mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and the potential for contracting Lyme disease depends on 3 big things. So it depends on the tick vector abundance, how many ticks are around, the prevalence of Borrelia burgdorferi infection in the tick, so that's the bacteria that causes Lyme disease, and the contact frequency between the human host and the ticks. And so the most important stage for all of these things is the nymph stage. So the nymphs are the stage that are most likely to bite humans or feed off of humans, and they feed in late spring and throughout the summer. And this is the time when humans are most likely be in contact with the ticks. The prevalence of infection depends a lot on the structure of the host community, so all the other animals that the ticks are going to be feeding off of, particularly the larva stage. So if the larvae are feeding off of animals more like the white-footed mouse, which is more likely to contain the bacteria, they'll be more likely to be infected at the nymph stage when they've been feeding off of humans, as opposed to if the larvae are feeding off of lizards or other animals that are less likely to be infected. So to varying degrees, climate will affect all 3 of these things, right? So the vector abundance, the prevalence of infection in the ticks, and the frequency of contact between the ticks and humans. And there are a lot of other factors that go into this as well. So we have to think about this in the environmental and institutional context. So if ecosystems are changing for other reasons, or if there are vector control efforts and public health efforts that are being implemented, and also the social and behavioral context, so all the social determinants of health and outdoor activities of humans. And to accurately project the changes in Lyme disease attributable to the changes in climate, we just need a lot of long-term data to be collected. But what we know now, and what we have seen over the past several years, is that Lyme disease incidence in the US has increased. It's nearly doubled from 1990 to 2014, as you can see from this graph, where it went from about 4 cases per 100,000 to about 8 cases per 100,000. And these maps are just another way to illustrate the increase in Lyme disease in the eastern US from 1996 to 2018, where you can see there's been a pretty big spread, especially in Pennsylvania and in areas in Ohio. So what this map shows here on the left is the Lyme incidence in Ohio in 2020. So the green dots represent incident cases in Ohio counties in 2020. And the graded orange background represents the sort of background incidence from 2010 to 2019. So you can see a lot of cases are in these dark orange areas in east central Ohio, but you can also see that there are several cases being reported so far in counties that had lower incidence in previous years. So like Cuyahoga County has several cases reported already, even though in the past several years we've had pretty low incidence. And the graph on the right shows the age distribution of Lyme cases reported to Ohio. And you can see that most cases were reported, or the highest number of cases were reported in school-age children and young adolescents, but there's a fairly even distribution over most ages. And this table on the left has the Ohio Lyme case statistics, and what I wanted to point out were the number of human cases in Ohio. In 2009, you can see there were 58 cases reported, and in 2018, there were 293 cases reported. So there's been a really dramatic increase in the state over the past several years. And the figure on the right shows the number of cases by week of onset. And so most cases occur in during the summer with onset during the late spring, early summer. And it's expected that with climate change that the seasonal onset will be earlier and that the season will be longer. And now I will turn it over to Arlene to talk about Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever.
Thank you, Kate. I'm Arlene Dent. It's nice to meet all of you virtually. We wanted to keep the rest of the talk very Ohio focused. So we're going to talk about infections that are most likely increasing because of climate change here in Ohio. So I wanted to talk next about a tick-borne disease, Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever. And again, the Ohio Department of Health is such a wonderful resource. And these maps and statistics come from there. You can see on the left-hand side how the darker communities had a higher incidence of Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever in the last 10 years. And as of the beginning of September, we've had 18 cases, which are in green. And of course, our season isn't over yet. It's still tick season at this point in time. And this disease, it is a little difficult to diagnose sometimes because the initial symptoms are really common to a lot of different diseases, be it fever, headache, nausea, myalgias. Those are common. Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever is associated with a rash in most cases, but not all. Unfortunately, this rash doesn't develop for several days, which can make the diagnosis difficult. And you can develop very serious disease. And because it's a vasculitis, you can have severe consequences like necrosis of fingers and toes, which then need to be amputated. You can have hearing loss, paralysis, and permanent mental disabilities from this disease. So on the left are the number of cases of Rocky Mountain Spotted Fever here in Ohio over time. And you can see that there were 18 cases in 2009, and now we're up to 38 cases a couple of years ago. And the number seems to be just increasing in general. All ages are affected by this disease. There's no one real target. And again, ticks don't target a specific age. They'll happily take a blood meal from anybody. I want to switch gears and talk about babesiosis a little bit because we don't talk about it here much in Ohio, and it's going to develop into a problem here as well. It is a parasite. It is not a bacteria, and it invades the red blood cell. So it's an intraerythrocytic parasite. It is a reportable disease, and what we've seen is that it is increasing over time. In 2011, for example, in the whole United States, there were over 1,000 cases. And just a few years ago, there were over 2,000 cases. And this number is only increasing. And we think that increase is due to the expanding deer population and is probably moving east as well. It's actually a major health problem in the United States compared to other places in the world. This babesiosis also affects Europe, but they have maybe 50 cases total. But it can be very severe there. So the life cycle is very much the same as Lyme disease, and Kate went over that very nicely. If a nymph takes a blood meal from a human being, it injects sporozoites, which enter red blood cells and develop asexually within the human host. But as they develop asexually, once they mature, they burst out of the red blood cell and go on to affect another red blood cell. So like many of these diseases we're talking about, the initial symptoms can be very mild or even asymptomatic. So if a person donates blood and they happen to have babesiosis, this parasite can be transferred into another human being via blood transfusion. And of course, you don't need a blood transfusion unless you're quite sick or very injured. So it can be very problematic, and I'll go into that next. So these are the symptoms and clinical findings of babesiosis. Mostly that's asymptomatic. This is the most common form of it. But otherwise, you can have very, again, non-specific flu-like symptoms. Fevers, headaches, myalgia, some nausea. But again, because those merozoites burst out of the red blood cell, it can cause hemolytic anemia. And people can present with jaundice and dark urine. Physical findings would include, of course, fever, but hepatosplenomegaly, as well as the jaundice and pallor, again, from that hemolytic anemia. You can get very severe disease. There are reports of people with ARDS, splenic rupture, again, because of that, hepatosplenomegaly, and it can result in death, especially in severely immunocompromised patients and in the elderly. One interesting thing about this particular infection is that co-infections can occur. These ticks can actually carry more than one pathogenic organism. So as many as 2/3 of patients with babesiosis can experience concurrent Lyme disease, and about 1/3 experience concurrent anaplasmosis or ehrlichiosis. And when those two diseases are combined, the symptoms are even more severe. Babesiosis is interesting too, in that you can have relapse in highly immunocompromised patients. And again, it can be difficult to diagnose because the symptoms are really non-specific. So it's recommended to get a blood smear for somebody who's having sort of non-specific findings, in somebody who's lived or traveled to an endemic area within 2 months, or received a blood transfusion within 6 months. These can be slow-growing parasites, but they can cause a lot of problems. The gold standard is actually microscopy, and this is what the parasites inside the erythrocyte look like. There is a classic Maltese cross triad form, which is almost pathognomonic for this particular parasite. You can also do PCR, which some centers may have and other centers won't, but everybody does have microscopy. There is serology, but it's not useful for an acute diagnosis, more that it confirms the diagnosis if there's a rise in titer 4 weeks later. So treatment and prevention, all infections, even if they're completely asymptomatic, should be treated. And sometimes they might incidentally be found in that if somebody runs a CVC with DIF, sometimes you can pick up the nuclei within a red blood cell and it prompts somebody to look at it from a pathologic standpoint. But the treatment is actually pretty easy. It's just azithromycin and atovaquone orally for 7 to 10 days. I won't get into treatment for severe disease because it's there for you to read if you choose to. But again, for those who are at high risk of relapse, that's the elderly and immunocompromised patients, the therapy can be extended for like greater than 6 weeks, even longer in some cases. But it needs to be extended after the point where you cannot detect the parasites in the blood for at least a couple weeks. So the most important thing, as Kate already mentioned, avoiding tick bites. Wear long sleeves, long pants, a hat in the woods. DEET is your friend. It's one of my favorite things. I love DEET wipes. But having insect repellent is really helpful. Tick checks after exposure, and of course deer control, which is controversial in some reasons. And I want to emphasize here that babesiosis is the most frequently reported transfusion-transmitted infectious agent. We've had more than 250 cases, and those numbers are only increasing. Now, what's to be done about this? Of course, well, why don't you check all the blood? It's really hard to do that for everybody, but blood centers in highly endemic areas have been testing it in sort of like homegrown tests since about 2010. And recently, the FDA approved a PCR-based screening method. However, there were some other assays, I believe, that were being evaluated at the same time. So formal guidelines have not yet been issued, and there is not national testing for babesiosis. So we'll switch gears here and talk about vector-borne diseases that are transmitted by mosquitoes. Kate already talked about that mosquitoes are common here in Ohio, but there are certain viruses that are prevalent in Northeast Ohio that are transmitted by mosquitoes. One is the cross encephalitis. Again, its reservoir is small woodland animals and rodents and that the mosquito can feed on. It's usually infecting children under the age of 16. That's where we see the most disease. St. Louis encephalitis and West Nile virus are also transmitted between mosquitoes and wild birds. Actually, horses can be a reservoir for West Nile virus. And they cause severe disease, especially in the elderly. That doesn't mean the kids can't get it. It's just a more severe disease in the elderly. And then Eastern equine encephalitis virus is also transmitted by mosquitoes. We haven't seen much of it in Ohio, and unfortunately, I have to use the word yet. And as Kate said, you know, these are vectors for Zika, dengue, and chikungunya. And I really like the image on the right. The mosquito is the world's deadliest animal. It's something to keep in mind and have a healthy respect for. So again, these data are from the Ohio Department of Health. This is La Crosse virus data with incidence since 1963. And you can see the darker colored counties have the highest incidence of La Crosse disease. And the dots that are in red is the 18 cases that we've seen in Ohio so far this year. And a lot of people, like many of the diseases we're talking about, can be infected with the cross virus and not have big simple symptoms. But those that do usually develop fever, headache, and nausea. And again, severe disease occurs in children less than 16, where you get that encephalitis, that inflammation of the brain. And it can be characterized by seizures, coma, paralysis, and it can have lasting neurologic complications. One of the good things about La Crosse virus is the mortality rate is really quite low, less than 1%, which is good. West Nile virus, you can see in the map there, we've only had 3 cases this year so far, but we certainly have had plenty in the past. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Many people are infected with West Nile that don't really have many symptoms, and you can have quite mild disease, just fever, headache, not feeling quite right. Maybe you don't even know you have West Nile is often the case. But severe disease can result in encephalitis or meningitis, seizures, coma, paralysis, and vision loss. And again, the graph on the right, the disease prevalence or severity really is higher in older people. So over 60 years old puts you at high risk, and about 10% with severe disease will die. These are the numbers from Ohio over time. We had a major outbreak in 2002 as West Nile virus essentially swept across the country, going from east to west. It happened to hit Ohio in about 2002. And since then, it's stayed around here sporadically. But one thing to keep in mind is these may be emerging diseases, but they can also reemerge. And you can see in 2012, we had an increase in cases there. So it can come back or reemerge or increase in incidence. This is a map of Eastern equine encephalitis virus over the last 10 years or so. And you can see that Ohio has been spared in the past. But the interesting thing, unfortunately, is this graph to the right, where in 2019, you see this huge jump in numbers. And unfortunately, timely, there was a CNN report just last week that people who live in Michigan are urged to stay indoors as they are racing to stop the spread of this Eastern equine encephalitis virus. This virus can cause very severe disease, and the mortality rate with it is 50 to 75%. If you survive Eastern equine encephalitis virus, 30% of those people have lasting morbidities. So what they have found in Michigan is that there are 22 horses who have this particular virus that are harboring it, and that's what the mosquitoes do feed on. So they are encouraging everybody to stay inside and doing massive spraying against the mosquitoes, trying to prevent an outbreak there in humans. And unfortunately, not unfortunately, but Michigan abuts Ohio, so we are at risk too, and it's something to keep in mind. So this isn't necessarily infectious diseases, but bed bugs. we have seen a dramatic increase in bedbug activity in Northeast Ohio. And again, just as Kate was saying, because the seasons are longer, they have a longer time to reproduce and spread. The CDC and US EPA have declared the bedbugs a pest of significant public health importance. And unfortunately, bedbugs are mostly resistant to our commonly used insecticides. One of the only ways to kill them is with heat, and that's really quite difficult. And with their longer reproductive time, they have an opportunity to get right back in where they want to be. So, though not an infectious disease, a real nuisance. So with that, we will say thank you, and I believe we will both be part of Q&As in the near future. Thank you.